Welcome back, everybody. In my video where I talked about who I thought was the greatest Pokemon player of all time, I mentioned that I would love to see the company do a Pokemon Hall of Fame. Now, while I think a Hall of Fame would generally be very positively accepted by the community, I think there would be a lot of debate in how the Hall of Fame should be ran and who should be put into the Hall of Fame. So, what I wanted to do a video about today was talk about how I would personally do a Pokemon Hall of Fame and then who my first inductees into that Hall of Fame would be. Now, I spent a lot of time thinking about what is the point of a Hall of Fame. And I looked at different companies, Magic, the WWE, and other sports franchises to see how they did their Halls of Fame. Now, I would say the main goal of the Hall of Fame is to preserve Pokemon history, honor top players and their achievements, show impact players had on the community, and ultimately, I want a Hall of Fame to be for players that I feel the community should remember. Now, how is this going to differ from the greatest player of all time? Or the greatest players of all time? In my opinion, when we're talking about the greatest players, that is 100% accomplishment based. The greatest players of all time should have very strong showings at Worlds, Nationals, International level events, while a Hall of Fame, in my opinion, is a little bit more subjective. Now, of course, I want players to have top finishes at top tournaments, but I also think that things like in-game skill, deck building, and overall community impact should be considered. And the way I'd go about choosing this would be some sort of qualifying system. My system would be a committee. I'm not entirely sure how I'd want to do this. I think it needs to be a very diverse committee because you want to do your best to avoid any sort of personal bias. Like I talked about in the last video, when Jason Kozinski gave his top players of all time, they were all LaFontaine members, while Kenny Wisdom's were almost entirely made up of Washington players. I think having that diverse committee would help try to avoid personal bias, but I know no matter how I did it, there would be some level of bias in the people in the committee. Now, the nomination requirements, I would like to do some sort of lifetime pro points, essentially points that are awarded at Worlds, Nationals, Internationals, and possibly even regional level events. And these would somehow be tied to annual championship points, but would not affect the top 16 race. So essentially, people that had pro points would get a little bit of a easier time getting a Worlds event. Maybe they'd start with 10, 20, 30 championship points, something like that. It depends on how many pro points they had. Nomination requirements also includes I want them to have at least one appearance in a Worlds, Nationals, or International top 8. I think while there are some fantastic players at regional level events that have done quite well at regional level events, I think having that top placing at a very high level tournament is important when considering who should be in the Hall of Fame. I'm only going to consider Nintendo era events because since Nintendo owns the company, they would be the ones running the Hall of Fame. While I think you can make some great arguments for some fantastic players in the Wizards of the Coast era, I'm only going to be looking at Nintendo era tournaments, which is going to be 2004 and forward. I want them playing at least 5 years prior to 2014 to avoid recency bias. So essentially, the only accomplishments that I'm going to consider are going to be between 2004 and 2014. Now, I know the number one complaint I'm going to get is, well, that means Tord can't be in your Hall of Fame. No, Tord's not going to be in my Hall of Fame, at least not the first year. Every single year is also going to add a year to the Hall of Fame. So next year we're going to look up to 2015. Following year is going to be 2016. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to avoid recency bias. I don't want to have it where it's in one season where somebody wins a regionals or two regionals, and then, oh, we've got to put them in the Hall of Fame. They've got to go in the Hall of Fame. I want a Hall of Fame to be for players where their accomplishments have stood the test of time, and we're removing just the most recent accomplishments. So while Tord is a fantastic player and absolutely should be considered for the Hall of Fame, I want his accomplishments to be a little bit farther out than what they are. At least 5 years in the Masters division. While I think junior and senior accomplishments are important, I think that any sort of Hall of Fame should be made up almost entirely of Masters accomplishments. And then cheating accusations or bans will be handled on a case-by-case basis. For me personally, any sort of hard cheating like a Greninja sitting on your lap would be an automatic disqualifier, and I wouldn't even consider a player in that sort of circumstance. Well, something a little bit more, I don't know how I want to say, code of conduct would be handled on a case-by-case basis. Essentially, disciplinary actions that were taken outside of something in a game. So considerations for nominees would be tournament results, in-game skill, deck building, innovation, community impact. Junior and senior accomplishments should pad resumes, but not make them. A great example of this for me would be Xander Apparel, who won nationals in 2011 as a junior. And while that's super impressive, I don't think that should have a huge impact on his consideration for a Hall of Fame spot. His top 4 Worlds appearance in 2017, in my opinion, is a much, much bigger deal and far more impressive than the junior win in 2011. However, that junior win in 2011 shows that Xander Apparel's consistency. He did very well as a junior, did very well as a senior, and then continued to perform as a master. And essentially what you're doing is you're just showing how do I want to say this? You're showing a course here and continued player growth, where he was always a fantastic player at a younger division, and then he just continued to grow and improve as he got older and into the higher divisions. Low-level events should pad resumes, not make them. While I think winning maybe a couple of regionals or something is very impressive, I don't think that alone should be enough to make an argument for somebody in a Hall of Fame spot. However, if you take somebody that's already a fantastic player, say Tord, for example, and then you start adding in some of these lower level events, that really starts to pad resumes. Now, I think we should do some sort of lifetime pro points. And essentially, you would get pro points based on your finish at high level events. Worlds, for 2016 and prior, it would be Worlds, US Nationals, which was always the largest nationals, medium-sized nationals like a UK Nationals, and then smaller nationals where usually somewhere between 15 and 30 players. And you'd have a tier system based on how many participants were in the tournament and how many pro points should be awarded based on that, and then regionals. Post 2016, as the system has changed, we'd do Worlds, international events, and then regionals. And of course, once again, those pro points would all be tiered. I could do an entire video on how I would set up the pro point system, but for this video, I'm just going to leave it as an overview. Now, this is where I'd like to see 2 other awards introduced into the community. The first is the Player of the Year award. This recognizes an individual player's achievement for that particular year, and I do one for junior, senior, and masters. So somebody like Tord, for example, in 2017, who won 3 international championships, would, in my opinion, absolutely be Player of the Year. While that is incredibly impressive, and I wouldn't consider it directly that year for a Hall of Fame spot, it would be an award that would show his accomplishments for the year and almost certainly warrant his spot included in the Hall of Fame after we get past that 7-year mark. The second one would be a Community Impact of the Year. There's been so many fantastic people in the Pokemon trading card game that have contributed to the success of the game, but not necessarily as a player. Great examples of this are going to be Carlos Pero, who completely created the online pairing system and made this so much smoother and better for large events. And of course, Doug Morosoli, who I think the term Doug Photo has been dubbed on Facebook for. Doug has spent so much time taking pictures of players at events, making sure those players have great pictures, and then sharing that with their parents and other members of the community. Stuff like this, where these are people that are not necessarily players, but have had very positive impacts on the community. I'd also like to see some sort of award where we could honor them as well. So my first 5 players that I'd induct into the Hall of Fame, I want to remind everybody this is not necessarily my top 5 best players in the world. Other factors like I discussed before going into this. And second of all, there are many deserving players that did not make my first year. The idea is that it is a highly debated topic within the community, which there can be a lot of discourse over. I want people to look at this list and say, oh my gosh, how did you not put so-and-so in? Or no, so-and-so's totally deserved a spot. I don't like how you did this. I want there to be debate. I want there to be discourse. I don't want to say, well, there's 30 really good players. Let's throw all 30 of them in. I want that debate. I want that discourse. I want that community involvement. So the first player, Yamato. Yamato's got a world's first place finish in 2004, a top 4, a top 8, top 16, and then 2 top 32s. He's an incredibly consistent player at the world's level. And then he is the first world champion, and he catapulted Japan to the front of competitive Pokemon. Essentially, for those first few years, when Japan was seen as an unstoppable force, this was largely due to Yamato, not only his in-game playing, amazing deck building skills, but just incredibly consistent world finishes. My second inductee into the Hall of Fame is going to be Ross Cawthon. Ross has 2 second place finishes at Worlds, 2 top 16s, and a top 32. He created both Bombtar and the Truth and is considered to be the best rogue deck builder of all time. Not only does Ross have amazing finishes at Worlds, just his ability to get those amazing finishes with completely crazy and innovative decks, in my opinion, makes him an easy inductee into my first year's Hall of Fame. Third is going to be Jason Klaczynski. You can't argue with Jason's Worlds results. Wins in 2006, 2008, and 2013, along with the top 32 in 2012. He also won Nationals in 2016. Absolutely fantastic player that always seems to be able to close out a tournament with a win. Absolutely easy inclusion into my Hall of Fame. Fourth is going to be Alex Presario. Alex has a World's top 8, top 16, and top 32. He's considered by many of the top players at the time to be the best player in the world during the years that he played. This is something you very commonly see or hear from Jason, Klaczynski, Chris Fulop, or even myself. Alex Presario, while he might not have 3 Worlds wins, was among the top players largely considered to be the best. He's got great in-game strategy and skill, and he's a top deck builder. He wouldn't necessarily innovate decks or completely take some crazy rogue strategy like Ross would, but essentially Alex would take probably the best deck in the format and then make it even better. Great examples of this are his Drag Trode list from 2006, and then his Empoleon deck from 2008, taking very established concepts and literally just making the deck above the top tier deck it already was. Lastly, Alex considers himself to be the most humble player in the history of the game by a relatively large margin. Sammy Sakum is going to be my last inductee. Sammy has a second place Worlds finish, 4 top 8s, 2 top 16s, and a top 32. Out of all the Worlds he's played in from 2004 to 2013, he only missed top cut at 1 World Championships. He's got 5 wins in the UK National Championship. I believe it's 5. When I went to fact check this, I messaged Chris Fulop. Chris's response to me was, well, we've kind of all lost count how many nationals Sammy has won. So essentially, if we're at the point where people can't even keep track of how many times you won your own national championships, you're obviously doing pretty well. He's an incredibly consistent player and another top deck builder. And somebody, in my opinion, would rival Alex as the top player in the game, especially in those early years. And unfortunately for Alex, I do actually think Sammy is probably the most humble player in the history of the game. Unbelievably great guy, unbelievably great player. So that's going to go ahead and wrap up my first year of who I would include in the Hall of Fame. I think you can make a lot of arguments, not only for my system, but also for how many people to include, and then, of course, the players you include. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? I guess, how would you do a Hall of Fame, and who would be in your top 5, or how many ever you want to do? I'd like to see some good discussion going down in the comments, so let me know your thoughts, but I hope to see you in the next video.